Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 18th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the resignation of Boris Johnson's former ethics advisor, Lord Geidt, actor Kevin Spacey appearing in court facing 4 counts of sexual assault, and Netflix announcing a reality spin-off version of Squid Game. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson. We also have science writer at The Eye, Tom Chivers, and from daily history podcast The Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. And Tom, you are kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week that we found out what's driving the energy crisis?
I switched to a new supplier in September, and my bills then would have been about £35 a month. And that supplier went bust 10 days later. And so Ofgem stepped in and have moved me to one of the big 6 suppliers. And my energy bills are now on their variable tariff rate at £68 a month. They've also got fixed rate tariffs, which are for 1 or 2 years, it's £99 or £92 a month. So that sounds like a lot more to me.
A caller to Moneybox on BBC Radio 4 back in January. So Tom, energy prices, not exactly under the radar. So what's the big news? What's happened this week?
Okay, so we've learned that ministers in the UK are trying to work out a way of preventing this the energy prices spiralling out of control by cutting the link between the price of gas and the price of electricity, which is increasingly what we are relying on.
Okay, so I think most of us probably don't realise that there is a link between gas and electricity in terms of pricing. Can you spell that out for us? What's the status quo?
Okay, sure. So at the moment, the cost of energy is pegged to the cost of the last bit of energy that is used to fill up our need. So say that our energy system was running on 95% renewables and it's really cheap, but the last 5% just to get up to complete demand is you need to use a gas powered station to fill it up, and that last bit of energy is charged at 4 times the price because the gas is more expensive as it currently is. Then that marginal cost is what you'll be charged at, and so that sends your entire energy bill up. So that's just the way the contracts were drawn with energy suppliers back when the gas-fired stations were being made. But it means that now that and it was fine back when gas prices were pretty stable. But now that they're spiking really badly, it's driving up the energy cost across the entire energy system, including much cheaper providers of energy like renewables.
Okay, so what would be the implications then of delinking gas from electricity?
Well, in theory, if you can find a clever way of reducing this direct link between gas and electricity, you could certainly reward people for choosing renewable, cheaper energy, and you could cut the cost of energy for everyone significantly. The trouble is finding clever financial ways of doing that, because obviously you need to make sure that the people producing the last bit of energy are still incentivized to do so. But there are financial, technical ways that people are trying to do this. One is called the contract for difference, which the government covers the upfront cost of a lot of building of these renewable places like offshore wind farms, which are expensive to build.
So how many people does this affect, Kate? How much of the UK's energy comes from renewables at the moment?
A huge amount, actually. It's almost half. According to data from the National Grid, which was published by the Daily Express, on Saturday of last weekend, wind power was actually generating 45.3% of all British electricity, so almost half of all electricity. And that was followed by nuclear at 21.5%, then gas at 18.4%, and then solar at 7.8%. And there was absolutely no coal, which is in line with the government's promise to phase out coal by 2024. And actually, Britain has taken enormous strides in terms of moving to renewable energy sources. In 2020, renewable electricity actually outpaced fossil fuel for the first time.
So this is actually a good news story in a way, Arion, isn't it? The success of renewables, I mean, for the planet and for business in the UK, I guess. But there is this injustice here that you make the choice to switch to renewables, and many people do, as Kate was just saying, but you're still paying for the fact that it can't quite make up all of your supply.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the good news side of the story is that renewables and nuclear energy are, at the moment at least, much cheaper than gas. But the problem is that consumers can't see it. So it's estimated that at present prices, generating power from new renewable energy is less than a quarter as expensive as gas, and the cost of new nuclear generation is about half that of gas. So there's this really strong case right now for the advantages of renewables, but consumers can't see those because they're paying a premium based on the price of gas. I saw a bit of research by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, which noted that the savings due to wind are going to be really profound over the next few years in particular. And even with the power that's being generated by the cheaper wind farms, which are coming online in the next few years, could save consumers $6.7 billion a year, which is equivalent to £85 per home if there's another gas crisis. And those rewards could get even bigger. And by 2030, if the UK actually does hit its target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind energy, then this would jump to 26 billion, which would be the equivalent of £330 per home. So there are these huge benefits to be found, but the problem is that at the moment we just can't see it because the legislation isn't there.
But the volatility at the moment is largely caused, isn't it, Tom, by the war in Ukraine? Should we be blaming the government for not having long-term planning around this and realising that this would be a factor, or is it sort of just something they couldn't have avoided?
Well, right, that the sort of proximal cause is the war in Ukraine, but I mean, it's not as if Europe gets large amounts of its gas from Russia, which affects our gas prices, or that generally our fossil fuels come from a variety of unstable petrostates was something we didn't realise. You know, it is both true that this specific in Ukraine might have been something you might not have been able to predict, but also the fact that we are relying on states like Saudi Arabia and Russia for large amounts of our energy security is probably not ideal. And you know, to be fair to the government, they have been moving very heavily towards renewable energy for years now. And these contracts were drawn up years ago, and now there is a move towards cleverer financial instruments to make the system work better. And maybe in a few years, next time there's a war in the Gulf states or something like that, it won't affect us quite like this because we've worked out a better way of drawing the contracts with energy producers.
So if this went through, Kate, how much could it save you on your bills?
It's really difficult to say exactly how much it would save you. I mean, obviously, Arion quoted those statistics just now, suggesting that decoupling could save consumers as much as £330 a home by 2030. But it's difficult to really say. But what is agreed is it definitely would save people money. We know that renewable energy is at least 4 times cheaper than gas. So it's clear that there would be savings, but exactly how much is hard to say.
And I think the other problem is that the timetable for change is potentially slow. So the Department for Business is expected to put forward their proposals for reform, as they say, in the coming weeks as part of this new energy security strategy. But then, hypothetically, if the legislation is introduced in autumn with this new energy bill, you know, critics say that that's just going to be way too late to save people from a really bad winter of high energy bills, and it could get worse if the situation in Ukraine continues the way it is and Russia continues to tweak its supply of gas to mainland Europe. As Tom was saying, they don't deliver an awful lot to the UK directly, but they do deliver a lot to Europe, and so we're dependent on the supply that's there for our own prices over here. So, you know, the questions that are being asked by critics at least is, why can't this happen more swiftly? We can see there's a problem. Why can't we address it immediately?
Well, is one of the answers to that, Tom, that it's just a bit more complex than it appears on the surface? And maybe that's one of the reasons why it's slightly underreported as well. Because you might be listening to this thinking, well, I don't have gas in my home. You know, we have electric supplier from renewables and we don't have gas. So why am I paying anything to do with gas? But just to be clear, when you were talking about that marginal bit earlier, when you're talking about how an electrical supplier works out where their supply comes from, even a company supplying just electricity just through renewables might at some point be relying on a top-up from gas, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, lots of people have signed up for green energy companies. We did, and I can't remember which one it is now, Bulb or Egg or something. But it's probably gone under since we did it. But they will, as best they can, green renewable sources, so wind and so on. But sometimes it's not sunny. Sometimes the wind does top it up from somewhere. Ideally, in a proper, a fully greenified energy mix, that'll be from stored energy that we've kept in batteries, or it'll be from nuclear or something else that we can in the background. At the moment, that's not the case. At the moment, you sometimes need to generate electricity with gas or coal or oil, and that's just the way it runs at the moment. So that will drive up the prices, even for people who aren't using gas at all in their homes and are on green energy tariffs.
I've got a question for Tom. What I learned in my research for this podcast topic was that some European countries like France and I think Greece and Germany seem to have actually taken measures to correct the energy cap problem. And I'm wondering, why can't we do something similar to what they've done and look to them for kind of guidance for how to tackle this complicated problem?
Sure. I mean, while being very careful to say that I'm not an economist and will probably get a lot of this wrong, my understanding is that you can put things like price caps on, but that distorts the market in various ways and would have its own knock-on effects. I mean, for a start, disincentivizing producers to make that last bit of marginal energy that was required to keep things up. I think there have been warnings of blackout in various parts of Europe where they have tried these things. So I think there are things you can do, but they're not without downsides, they're not without trade-offs. So the thing you can do in the longer term is rewrite these contracts, find clever ways of incentivizing people to produce the marginal energy without driving the cost straight onto the consumer. But that involves building new energy systems, signing new contracts with providers, rather than tearing up the contracts you've already got with providers, which obviously, for a start, ruins your trust with the providers themselves and leads you in problems down the line. But also, I think, has these knock-on effects, these trade-offs that aren't always positive.
Okay, and if I was to pass you a crystal ball now, solar-powered, obviously, what would you reckon is actually going to happen? Is this something that people feel needs to be done but actually won't happen?
No, I think I have to say, I mean, just speaking to a couple of people I vaguely know in and around the industry and sort of government energy policy, they're pretty good. They're trying. They're like the contracts for things like the new offshore wind farms. They are designed along these lines to lower the barrier. We know this costs you loads of money to build these expensive wind farms or this massive nuclear power station. So we'll help you with that, but in return, you will give us fixed price, low cost energy for years and years. Because we the government aren't particularly worried about putting out about the risk, the financial risk to us, but which you guys would be. But we want to save money over the long term, so it works out for both parties. The risk is low for the producers and therefore the consumer.
Okay, Arion, you're up next. After this,
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that the gene genie is out of the bottle.
Relatives you've never met can take DNA tests that affect you, and the actions you take can affect relatives that you don't even know. If you think you've taken precautions to protect your privacy online, you could still find yourself out of luck. As DNA tests get more and more popular, databases like GEDmatch get bigger and bigger. Soon, it won't be hard to imagine a world where anyone can be found, for whatever reason, through a relative's DNA. The idea of your DNA being private no longer exists.
A video from The Atlantic called "You Should Be Worried About Your DNA Privacy." Arion, should we be worried about our DNA privacy?
Well, we should, according to the founder of a business that encrypts people's genetic data. You'll be unsurprised to learn that that's his position. But anyway, he wrote an opinion piece about how we do need to be incredibly careful about who has access to our DNA records. His name is Chris Vett, and he's the founder of GeneCrypt. And he wrote in the New Zealand publication Stuff that millions of people are sharing genetic information with sites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Many of us might might have done this ourselves. I certainly have done Ancestry.com. And he argued that there could be potential for that information to be exploited by insurers, employers, advertisers, identity thieves, loads of different people.
And his solution to that is a thing called gene crypting. What's that, Kate?
Yeah, that's right. So he is the founder of GeneCrypt, which is a New Zealand-based startup from the Unitec Institute of Technology in Auckland. And they're essentially creating an encryption system which protects the genomic data of people who have had their DNA sequenced. So that might be for health reasons or for people who have done like what Arion did and gone on something like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. And they're basically just hoping to stop the potential for the misuse, theft, or discriminatory use of DNA data obtained from testing.
But isn't that just sharing your DNA with yet another company, Arion? How's that really going to, prevent people leaking it?
Well, I think this is a big question, and there's obviously lots of hacking incidents that take place every year across all sorts of businesses, but these sort of DNA gathering websites with whom we freely share our DNA information could be subject to those sorts of hacks, and I guess that's the concern on one level. But a sort of similar question was being raised in another article written by two law professors last week for The Conversation, a really interesting piece, about how genetic paparazzi with DNA collection kits, as they sort of imagined them, may soon be tracking famous people. And they were saying courts just aren't ready to confront the massive legal quagmire that's going to come from this kind of like physical DNA threat, quite apart from the sort of hacking that may take place on Ancestry.com or whatever.
So hold on, I mean, this all sounds quite lofty, but on a very basic level, Tom, is this just a case of because someone spat into a swab to send off for an ancestry test online, you'll be able to frame them for a crime because you'll have access to their DNA. So it's sort of like an advanced version of leaving a bit of their hair lying around.
I don't want to be too willing to dismiss the whole concern, but
Well, you do a bit.
I worry when I read stories like this that people both overestimate the power of genetic testing and sort of are doing it down at the same time somehow. That I can understand why people be concerned about people tracing their DNA around things. Now, the idea of framing someone using their DNA, I mean, let's face it, most crimes aren't carried out by criminal masterminds who are going to... Most murders are carried by people hitting someone over the head because they get angry, The idea that they'll then go around dropping DNA that they've nicked off 23andMe to go cover their tracks seems unlikely to me. I mean, maybe there'll be some instances, I don't know. But my concern is that this worry about, it's understandable worry about privacy and DNA, can get in the way of real medical breakthroughs. I mean, if people are always worried about DNA in the NHS, but if the NHS could find a way of sharing its incredible range of DNA data with people, you could make amazing breakthroughs, I think, about the genetic basis of various diseases. I mean, it's not that long ago that studying the DNA of hundreds of thousands of people in what's called a genome-wide association study, looking at the genomes of hundreds of thousands of people, discovered that, for instance, I think it was motor neurone disease was a autoimmune disease, a kind of autoimmune disease related to rheumatoid arthritis and things. And that was a totally new insight that provided ways of will hopefully provide ways of treating this horrible disease and so on. And we get that by looking at large numbers of genomes. And my concern is by people raising these worries about real but quite rare and abstruse ways in which DNA sharing could go wrong, that we're going to scare off the public from allowing us to do things with their DNA which would really drive forward medical research.
Okay, but Kate, to give an example, it's not just finding your hair at a crime scene, is it? Something that people are worried about, for example, is if there's more open data, if more institutions have access to more of our genomics, then an insurance company, for example, might be more likely to know that I'm more likely to develop bowel cancer or whatever it is, and therefore put up my premium. It's that kind of thing that is a genuine concern.
Yeah, I think it's that for sure. It's the question of whether it will affect someone's insurance. It's also things like whether advertisers will end up using that data against people, also identity thieves who could then use the data for things like blackmail and hacking. But I wanted to mention, obviously, Tom briefly talked about the NHS, and for people who are worried about their genetic data being used against them when they're offered a genetic test by a doctor, the NHS has some really reassuring information on its website. It really loudly and clearly states that it will not give your genetic test results to an insurance company without your consent. And also, all that genetic data is regulated by a voluntary government code called the Code on Genetic Testing and Insurance. And it's similar in the US. They have if a doctor takes a DNA sample, that's protected by something called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and there are limits on how it can be shared. So I think in terms of health data, there are definitely fewer risks and there are a lot more protections there than when people use consumer DNA testing kits.
Okay, that's very reassuring. But Arion, you're a great catastrophist. What did you see in your research that made you think we should be worried?
Well, I think what Kate's saying is right, and it's important to note, of course, that that sites like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, their business model is predicated on them being able to hold on to this data without us worrying about it.
Paint a fun dystopian picture for us.
Okay, so here's the fun dystopia then. So do you remember those? Yeah. So do you remember those photos of the French president Emmanuel Macron sitting down with Vladimir Putin at opposite ends of this comedically long table? The reason for that was that Macron had declined to take a Russian COVID-19 test because of his concerns about what the Russian government might end up doing with his DNA. And the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also refused to do the same. And, if you're thinking about that sort of Black Mirror stuff, what could they have done with this? Well, we know that Russia is engaged regularly in the collection of what they call compromat, this compromising material on their would-be political adversaries. And I suppose if your DNA fell into their hands, then the sorts of things that the Russians could do if you were Emmanuel Macron is things like look into your past generations and expose embarrassing details about who you're related to, or potentially find illegitimate children that you have not yet conceded to that could harm your electoral hopes at home. Also, they could potentially look for the possibility of certain diseases, and that could be used by your political rivals back home to suggest that you're not up to the job. The American presidents famously take fitness tests to demonstrate how robust they are, in spite of the fact that they're all about 1,000 years old. But there's also this. If you go to the full Black Mirror version, some people have suggested that the kinds of concerns that Scholz and Macron may have been concerned about is a targeted bioweapon based on the DNA or genetics that had been gathered by Russia. And I think that's still pretty fanciful. I don't think that that's close.
How would that even work? What, like identifying some particular genetic sequence that would target only Macron if you bombed Paris?
I presume some sort of a weakness that Macron has that other people don't, that they can then have a weapon that, some sort of gas that I don't know. I don't even know what it would look like, but a gas that they put in the room, but it kills him and no one else. But I think that it is important to think of those things as being limited in the reality of how close we are to delivering them. But if you look at, say, another case in point that the writers of that article identified, which was the fact that Madonna has been known to go around the world being incredibly cautious about her DNA, so much so that she hires cleaning teams to sterilize her dressing rooms after concerts and wipe down toilet seats so that she doesn't leave any genetic trace. And her concern might be of some fan, they suggested, potentially creating some hybrid Madonna/fan child in the next generation. Again, we're a long way off this sort of technology being possible.
But not that far off that, are we, Tom? I mean, if we take it as a given that Madonna has crazy fans, just as a purely scientific question, my understanding is we may only be sort of 10 to 20 years away from being able to take a DNA sample rather than sperm and egg.
Yeah, I definitely listening to what Arion's been saying and thinking, actually, this doesn't sound all that. It doesn't sound so. Yes, we are not far away from being able to make viable gametes from somatic cells, that is, like you making sperm or egg from your skin cell or something like that. That's not far away and will be a brilliant thing for a lot of people who can't otherwise have children, obviously. I imagine how that would go wrong, right, is if you try and take the DNA from Madonna's dressing room and you very carefully go around, and then what you end up is the hybrid son of yourself and Madonna's makeup artist. Unless you already know what Madonna's DNA is, you won't know that you've got the right DNA. So that's a possible failure mode of that. But, and also, I don't know what systems for organising these things will be a few years down the line. But it's not scientifically impossible, I agree.
There we are, Arion. Your story, not completely insane. Kate, you're up next after this. Okay, Kate, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the news now old news?
We live in an age of extremes, also when it comes to some aspects of news and media use. While many of the most commercially successful news media are doing well by primarily serving audiences that are crudely put, like me, affluent, highly educated, privileged, in many countries, white, male, and middle-aged or older, questions, I think, continue to mount around the connection between journalism and much of the public. The purpose of our research at the Reuters Institute is to ensure that reporters, editors, and news media executives, and others who care about the future of journalism can understand these trends and many others to inform how they, on the basis of their own different ideals and interests, choose to adapt to a changing environment.
Director of the Reuters Institute, Rasmus Nielsen, speaking about their digital news report earlier this week. Kate, what did it say?
So I obviously have quite a bit of vested interest in this story, being a journalist who specifically covers the news. But I do think that there were some really interesting takeaways from this report. It's an annual report that's done by Reuters Institute, and it looks at how people connect with the news and journalism as a whole. And this year it was based on a YouGov survey of over 93,000 online consumers in 46 markets, so covering half of the world's population. And some of the takeaways that I thought were really interesting was that significantly, almost half of this year's respondents, or 46% of those who took part in the survey, said they avoid the news sometimes or often, which is almost twice the levels seen in 2016. And less than half of the sample said that they were very or extremely interested in news, compared with 67% in 2015, so not even that long ago.
So what do you think's driving that decline then?
So the report cites various reasons given by what they call selective news avoiders. That's how they describe people who are making the decision to switch off the news. One of these reasons is that, and this was actually given by a lot of respondents, they said that they're just put off by the repetitiveness of the news agenda, especially around things like politics and COVID-19. It's probably worth mentioning that the main survey was actually done before the conflict in Ukraine started in February, but then afterwards the Reuters Institute surveyed 5 countries after the invasion, including Poland and Germany, and found that selective news avoidance had increased even further, which is likely due to the kind of difficult, depressing coverage.
I mean, looked at as selective news avoidance, Tom, this might seem like bad news for those of us who make a living by publishing things in the media. But I suppose you could look at it as the flip side, which is these people are selecting other things, some of which will also be published by the media. I mean, they might be choosing entertainment instead because there's a wider choice of options. They might be, finding things like this, podcasts and blogs and Substacks that are interesting to them. So it's not necessarily that they're lost as consumers, just they're being more selective, and that's the word.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for people. I think I shouldn't say this because I work for a newspaper and I'm doing this, but I think a lot of the time, a lot of the news isn't telling you stuff that you need to know to navigate the world. I mean, a lot of the news is, by its nature, is driven to sell papers or drive clicks, and a lot of that is not always going to be aligned with the sort of thing that people need to know to engage in democracy or why their bills are going. There will always be enough murders and enough awful things to fill the news, no matter how rare they get, because there are billions of people in the world. So I quite often think, well, a lot of this just isn't important to me. I would rather, not to plug you guys, but I'd rather read a sort of roundup of the stuff that is important and then worry less about having to sift through several newspapers and a constant sort of fire hose of information, a lot of which isn't that relevant. So, yes, if people are wisely choosing to to only read the stuff they think is important, and then go and spending the rest of their time watching Stranger Things, is that so bad? They can live their lives without a lot of this stuff. So yes, I think it is fine, and I'm not worried.
Well, and that's it, isn't it? I mean, that is the brand values of the week, Arion, but it is, predicated on the idea that you can actually, in a briefing, get what you really need to know once or twice a week. And actually the sort of onslaught of news everywhere is convenient when you need it, but maybe you don't need it that often.
I mean, that's one of the things that this study pointed to, that the way people used to get news was very different, that you might buy a newspaper in the morning and then you might check in and watch the TV news in the evening, and that would be your two interfaces with what's going on in the world that day, whereas now we are bombarded with this stuff all day, every day in our pockets. And so the idea of news avoidance is just simple sort of survival behavior on everyone's behalf, because otherwise we'd just be inundated with it. But I think, I'm sympathetic to what Tom's saying about that there is a lot of news that we don't need to know about, like, individual tragic sad stories about a death in so-and-so location that is sort of titillating. It's interesting. It piques some part of the human brain, but it doesn't tell us something that is broad and necessary for us to ingest. But I think part of the problem for journalists, at least, when looking at this information, is that the things that were driving people away were the big stories that at least journalists feel they need to read. Things like COVID-19 and like the war in Ukraine. These are things that have genuine, real-world effects, not only on nation states, but also on individuals. And so it's depressing to think that that is the stuff that's making people switch off, not the sort of individual tragedy that happened along very far away from you.
But I suppose what those stories have in common, Kate, is a sense of powerlessness for the person listening. And like Tom was saying, a lot of modern platforms now are about providing you with things that are relevant to you at that moment. TikTok, for example, is an algorithm, isn't it, that says this is something you would like. And so you listen to the news and it's like, I can't do anything about this. This is just it. And so the feeling is that you feel depressed, I suppose, for a lot of people hearing the same sort of miserable story day in, day out.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you say that, because 16% of the people surveyed by the Reuters Institute said that they were a selective news avoider because the news leads to feelings of powerlessness for them. That was 16%, so it's quite high. And your point about mental health is also an interesting one. That was another big factor given, particularly for those under 35, for saying why they wanted to avoid the news. And I think when you're reading a lot of doom and gloom, it definitely does impact your mental health. It can make you feel hopeless. It can make you feel anxious. And I think also you raised the point of kind of people consuming news in a different way on social media and on their phones. And that means that we kind of don't escape the news in the way that people used to. It means that rather than kind of getting your news when you watch the news at 6 and then you watch the news and then you kind of spend the rest of your day, maybe you'll look at the paper in the morning, but then you don't really think about it. Now we get these alerts on our phones, which I personally have switched off, because I just sometimes, I don't want to be drawn into a big news story when I'm just kind of living my life, and I feel like they're quite invasive. We've also got really easy access to news apps. Emails, we get a lot of email newsletters which have got news in them too. It's kind of everywhere, and it's a lot more difficult to escape these days.
There were also interesting things in this survey, Arion, weren't there, about trust and different brands? People were polled across different news brands. Who do you trust? Who do you not? Some of the ones that are always divisive, like The Sun and The Guardian, for example, sort of polled in ways you'd expect, I guess. You know who likes those brands and who doesn't. I was surprised to see that the BBC, despite having a bit of a lift in trust after its pandemic reporting, is still down hugely on where it was 10 years ago in terms of trust. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there have been some fairly concerted and quite politicised attacks on the BBC over this same period. So even though they might have been getting a boost out of the coverage of the pandemic, which I think people really did go to the BBC because it felt like the trustworthy, reliable and accurate source of information that you could get on that particular topic, I think that they were simultaneously being hit with these attacks that have been gradually coming in sort of as a manoeuvre towards potentially limiting funding to the BBC or even slashing the licence fee. So I think that there's this sort of particular pressure that the BBC is under, but I think the broad news, about 29% of people surveyed saying that the news in general is untrustworthy or biased, is a concern, and one that journalists need to look at, though quite how you address that and try to mitigate people's concerns, especially in the age of fake news, I think is very difficult. It's not a straightforward question.
May I jump in here with a point that that something else I read this week which seems relevant, that while trust in journalism and consumption of journalism seems to be going down, data from the government's labour force survey found journalists has gone up by 50% in the last 6 years. And, I'm sure that's what it is, people writing blogs and Substacks and things, which, but nonetheless, it is a lot driven by the fact that people want to be journalists. They want to be writers and they want to have opinions in the news. And so that we've got this unfortunate situation for those of us who work in the industry where we've got a collapse in demand and a massive increase in supply. So from an economics point of view, we might be struggling a little bit in the next few years.
Yeah, well, that hints at maybe the word journalist no longer meaning someone who's been trained to write or broadcast in a particular fashion with an emphasis on facts, Kate, but someone who just participates in a kind of news-driven entertainment format, which inevitably is going to decline trust, isn't it?
Yeah, in some ways, the advent of social media has kind of leveled the playing field in some ways, in terms of kind of journalism has traditionally been quite a white male industry, and in many ways it still is, and in some ways it's kind of the advent of social media has been great in allowing kind of different voices to explain topics to a wide proportion of society, rather than it previously just hearing from the same kind of types of people. But it's definitely a good point that it also means that perhaps fewer checks and balances when people are kind of doing this independently rather than as part of a wider organisation with rules and kind of regulations about how journalism is conducted. And I think that definitely ties in with the point that you were making about trust. Something else that I thought was really interesting from the survey was that 8% of those who responded actually said that part of the reason why they're switching off the news is that they're finding it too hard to understand, which I think is a really important lesson for media outlets to take on board, and when really kind of thinking about the coverage that they should be providing, and who they're talking to, and how important it is to make messages clear and to simplify language and to better contextualize complex stories.
That's difficult though, isn't it, Arion? How do you do that? Like if for example, if you're the editor of the News at 10 for ITV or the BBC, and you know that your audience is getting older and is sort of by its nature kind of more educated than the rest of the audience that watches the channel, by trying to broaden the appeal of what you're doing, you could end up making a niche audience even more niche, as people say, well, I know this already. I know what Brexit is. Why are you explaining things to me that I know?
Yeah, I mean, TV is difficult, but if you look at something like how The Guardian addressed that question, they had these fold-out boxes where it sort of offered the opportunity for people to just seek clarification. Like, okay, so hang on, what is the relationship between Ukraine and Russia in the more distant past? And so if you didn't know that already, you could just click on that, get the fold-out box, they give it to you in 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then it goes back to the sort of thrust of the article itself. I'm not quite sure how that would translate to TV news. Maybe it would be a sort of red button-based solution. But I think that there is something in sort of finding ways to reach people who otherwise would be bored by it, just as I think it's important to try to address those people whose concern is that the news brings them down. But actually working in news on that front, I'm not quite sure what the solution is there, because anytime, and I can tell you, we've tried to introduce kind of a new section that is only positive news. People just don't go for it. They may say that they want happier stories, but when you give it to them, they end up clicking on the death and destruction anyway.
I'm bored and I want to be cheered up, so I'm going to wrap things up there. My thanks to Tom, Arion and Kate for their excellent choices of stories. Positive stories all. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.